Good morning, everybody. Chester RP Church Devotional Podcast. Thanks for being with us. We'll get started as Roy finishes up. Crimond. All right. Well, thank you so much for being with us this morning. As we jump into it, we're going to read the book of Jonah this morning. Jonah chapter 2. Continuing on here in we'll start with verse 17 of chapter 1 into chapter 2 of the book of Jonah. Jonah is thrown into the sea, and now we pick this up in verse 17. And the Lord appointed a great fish to swallow up Jonah. And Jonah was in the belly of the fish 3 days and 3 nights. Then Jonah prayed to the Lord his God from the belly of the fish, saying, I called out to the Lord out of my distress, and he answered me. Out of the belly of Sheol I cried, and you heard my voice. For you cast me into the deep, into the heart of the seas, and the floods surrounded me. All your waves and your billows passed over me. Then I said, I am driven away from your sight, yet I shall again look upon your holy temple. The waters closed in over me to take my life. The deep surrounded me. Weeds were wrapped about my head at the roots of the mountains. I went down to the land, whose bars closed upon me forever, yet you brought up my life from the pit. O Lord my God, when my life was fainting away, I remembered the Lord, and my prayer came to you. In your holy temple, those who pay regard to vain idols forsake their hope of steadfast love. But I, with the voice of thanksgiving, will sacrifice to you. What I have vowed I will pay. Salvation belongs to the Lord. And the Lord spoke to the fish, and it vomited Jonah out upon the dry land. Jonah is swallowed up by the fish. He recognizes at the end of chapter 1 that he is the problem. He is trying to run from God and before the face of God. We all have that tendency in our lives. In disobedience, he wants to go his own way. The Lord sends the storm upon the sea. It gets worse and worse. Finally, the sailors say, listen, what are we going to do? He says, throw me overboard. They don't want to do it, but finally they have to throw him overboard. The Lord in his provision and his grace provides a great fish to swallow up Jonah, to keep Jonah from dying. The fish swallows Jonah, and Jonah is in the belly of the fish for 3 days and 3 nights. In the midst of the belly of the fish, Jonah prays this beautiful prayer. I called out to the Lord out of my distress. He answered me. Out of the belly of Sheol I cried, and he heard my voice. And then he continues on, and he says that the Lord has reached down and saved him as the waters were closing in upon him. The deep surrounded him. Weeds were wrapped around his head. He was at the roots of the sea mountains. I went down, and I was closed forever, yet you brought my life up from the pit, O Lord my God. At this moment, we see Jonah has hit literally rock bottom, the rock bottom of the sea, but also rock bottom in life figuratively. The storm has taken its toll. It's been effective. It's brought him to a point of complete and total humility and dependence upon God. And he has to cry out in that moment. And one of the things that's so interesting is that storm can rage and rage and rage and rage and rage in the lives of God's people. And God can send us warning after warning after warning with the raging of the sea, and oftentimes we'll just remain hardened. I think it's fascinating that Jonah went to sleep in the hull of the boat in chapter 1 in the midst of the storm, because he had just decided he was going to turn off his heart. He was going to turn off his heart to the Lord. He was in pride. In his arrogance, he had made his decision that he was going to follow his own way and not submit to the way of the Lord. And he went to sleep. He was satisfied with that decision. And we can choose to ignore. The wind and the waves can be blowing all around us, the feelings down inside our soul that we're to blame for the problems, we got sin in our lives, etc. And we just choose to flat out ignore the Lord. And he can send warning after warning after warning, but we won't hear them. And then he has to get drastic and throw us into the sea, as it were. And we have to sink down to the mire and to the muck and to the bottom of the sea. And then he provides the way out through the belly of the stinking fish. But yet the stinky fish, the nasty belly, he gets swallowed into that fish, and he's there for 3 days. And in the midst of that's where we see his humility come to the foreground. And his willingness to say, yeah, right, yes, Lord, your way is right. You are right, and I will rest and trust in you. Now, Jonah didn't fully learn his lesson, we'll see in chapter 4, but in this moment, he is willing to sacrifice himself and say, you know what, I'm going to follow you. You save me in your grace. And the beauty of this story, I think, is also found in the way in which God chooses to redeem Jonah. Jonah doesn't deserve that redemption. Jonah doesn't deserve that fish. Jonah doesn't deserve that that opportunity in God's grace. Jonah deserves to die in the midst of that sea for his rejection and rebellion against God. He deserves to be separated from God in eternity. But yet God in his grace sends forth his fish. And for us, God sends forth his Son, who was in the belly of the earth for 3 days and 3 nights on our behalf. And God hears our prayers and hears our cry. So, I think Jonah's story is a really helpful story, but it's one that shows us humility oftentimes comes when we learn to submit to him, but sometimes we have to go to drastic places before we find that humility and dependence upon the Lord. May we learn from the warnings of the storm around us, repent before we get thrown into the heart of the sea, and give God praise for the one who went into the belly of the earth on our behalf for 3 days so that we may have life eternal with Christ. You guys take care. See you tomorrow.